Before anyone understood who she was, before her name sent shockwaves through the chain of command, before the truth carved a career-ending crater in the life of the man who dared lay a hand on her, there was only the moment when the crowd went silent and the air grew impossibly thin. It happened so fast most people thought they imagined it, a shift in atmosphere like pressure dropping before a storm, but I felt it. I swear I did. And if you believe that some people carry a presence that only reveals itself when danger strikes, go ahead and like and subscribe right now, because everything that followed began with that single, awful instant. It was supposed to be nothing more than a family day on the base, a simple Saturday where food trucks lined a far fence, kids raced between inflatable obstacle courses, and music drifted lazily from cheap speakers perched on folding tables. I remember thinking how normal it all felt, how normal she looked, standing near the craft booth with two toddlers tugging at the hem of her soft gray shirt. Ava Reyes wasn't loud, didn't demand attention, didn't carry herself the way most people imagine warriors do. She was 28 but looked younger in the sunlight, her hair tied in a loose knot, her hands moving gently as she passed her kids little cups of lemonade. No one there could have guessed what her file contained, what she had survived, or what she was trained to do. They certainly couldn't have guessed she'd once been the youngest operator in a program that technically doesn't exist. And because she was quiet, because she didn't wear rank on her sleeve or medals on her chest, the man who hit her assumed she was nothing. That's how these things start. One arrogant assumption feeding the next until the consequences become impossible to contain. It happened near the VIP tent, where the senior staff were gathering for some photo op the general insisted on. Something about showcasing approachability for the families. The irony of that will never leave me. The roped-off area wasn't well marked, and Ava's youngest, barely 3, curly-haired, clutching a half-melted popsicle, wandered a few feet past the line chasing a bubble drifting in the breeze. Ava followed him instinctively, the way any mother would, scooping him up before he tripped over a cable. She stepped back, murmuring an apology to no one in particular, until General Roland Burke turned and saw her standing inside what he considered sacred ground. Burke was a man who liked being seen, liked the weight of his own uniform, liked the way junior officers stiffened when he entered a room. He built his entire authority on theatrics and expectation, not on character. And Ava, without intending to, disrupted his stage. He marched toward her with that heavy, stomping stride you see in men who believe the earth should shift out of their way. He didn't even look at the child in her arms. He didn't see the weary concern on her face or hear her attempt to step back across the line. All he saw was someone he assumed was a young dependent ignoring a boundary meant for real personnel. "You people never pay attention," he barked, his voice loud enough that several families nearby turned. Ava tried again, calm, steady, not defensive. "Sorry, sir. My son, don't talk back," he snapped, closing the distance in 2 steps. Then he grabbed her arm. Hard. The kind of grip that's meant to embarrass, not restrain. The toddler in her arms whimpered, confused by the sudden tension. And just like that, "God help us," the general slapped her. The sound wasn't loud. I've heard louder claps from a child snapping a glow stick. But the effect was seismic. Her older child, maybe 5, burst into tears, grabbing at her leg. People froze mid-conversation. A woman in a stroller line gasped. A volunteer dropped a stack of napkins. Even the music seemed to stutter. But Ava, she didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't crumble or cry or scream. She simply straightened, subtly, instinctively, like a switch flipping inside her. Shoulders set, chin lifted, feet planted, a posture that didn't belong to a civilian, a posture that didn't belong to anyone untrained. Looking back, that was the moment everything changed. That one tiny shift, barely visible unless you knew what you were looking at, was the first glimpse of the truth even Burke didn't realize he had just swung his hand at. Instead of shouting, Ava spoke with a stillness that chilled even me, and I was 10 feet away. "Sir," she said softly, "you're frightening my children." Burke's response was immediate, blistering with the confidence of a man who had been obeyed all his life without question. "Sergeant," he yelled toward a nearby group of Marines. "Detain her for obstruction and trespassing." The closest sergeant, young, squared away, sharp-eyed, took 1 step forward, then froze. Not because he feared Burke, but because he'd seen something the general hadn't. When Burke had grabbed Ava's arm, the sleeve of her shirt had slid up just enough for that sergeant to spot a sliver of ink on the inside of her forearm. A symbol most people wouldn't recognize, but everyone in special operations would. I saw the sergeant's entire expression change. Confusion first, then shock, then something bordering on fear, not of Ava, but of what her presence meant. Burke didn't notice. Of course he didn't. He was too busy demanding compliance, puffing up, throwing around rank like it could shield him from consequences he couldn't even imagine. By then phones were recording, people were whispering, children were crying, and Ava, who could have snapped Burke's wrist without breaking a sweat, simply held her son tighter and whispered, "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here." She wasn't trembling. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't cowed. She was calculating, waiting, not because she feared what would happen if she acted, but because she feared what would happen if she didn't. Because the truth that would soon detonate across that parade field, is that Ava Reyes had spent the last decade of her life doing things people like Burke read about in classified briefings. She had fought in places that aren't marked on maps, pulled teammates out of buildings that no longer exist, and carried secrets she was never allowed to acknowledge. She had been forged in silence and shadows. And now she stood, a mother holding two crying children, facing a man who genuinely believed he had the right to strike her. What Burke didn't know, what no one around us yet understood, was that he had just hit a Navy SEAL, and in doing so, he had just signed the death warrant for his own career. But the full truth, the eruption, the reckoning, that was still coming. And by the time it arrived, nothing on that base would ever be the same again. What happened next didn't explode all at once. It gathered, slow and quiet, like electricity crawling along a wire before the surge finally hits. The general kept shouting, oblivious to the shift in the crowd, oblivious to the sergeant who still hadn't moved to detain Ava, and oblivious to the fact that nearly every phone in a 20-foot radius was now recording him with wide-eyed disbelief. His voice rose, ordering, threatening, barking the same stale lines of authority he'd leaned on for decades. While Ava simply stood there with her arms wrapped protectively around her children, her body calm but braced, like a soldier operating on instincts she'd spent years trying to bury. The sergeant's eyes flicked again to the tattoo on her arm, the one that wasn't supposed to exist on anyone who wasn't part of a unit that technically wasn't acknowledged. I could practically see his pulse jump, his expression torn between fear, awe, and the rigid discipline drilled into him. "General Burke," he tried, his voice lower now, but Burke snapped back at him without even looking. "Arrest her. Are you deaf, Sergeant? Put her in restraints." Instead of obeying, the sergeant's spine straightened, the kind of posture shift that only happens when a soldier realizes the man commanding him is dangerously wrong. And he wasn't the only one. Two lieutenants nearby had gone stone still, their eyes fixed on Ava the way you might stare at a fire you suddenly realize could turn into an explosion. But it wasn't the tattoo alone that set them off. It was the way she carried herself after the slap, the way her feet were planted, the way her breathing had slowed, the way every muscle seemed to brace for the next move. Anyone with combat experience recognized that readiness instantly. Civilians think fear makes you shaky, but real fear, the kind you train for, makes you still. Perfectly, chillingly still. The crowd sensed it even if they didn't understand it. Somewhere behind us, a child whispered, "Mommy, she's not scared." And the mother, eyes wide, gently shushed him. And that was when the air shifted again. Rear Admiral Jonathan Collins, the highest-ranking officer on that entire installation, stepped into view. No one noticed him at first because he didn't shout. He didn't push. He didn't demand attention. He simply walked with purpose, eyes fixed on the scene like he'd been watching long enough to understand exactly what was unfolding. Burke didn't see him. He was too busy trying to stare down the sergeant, who still refused to lay a hand on Ava. But the sergeant's eyes flicked over Burke's shoulder and widened. "General," he said softly. "Sir, you need to stop." "Or what?" Burke thundered. "Do your damn job, Sergeant." The sergeant didn't answer. The Admiral did. "General Roland Burke," Collins said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade sliding free of its sheath, calm and cold and absolute. "Step away from Chief Reyes. Now." "Chief." That word hit the crowd like a shockwave. A few people murmured in confusion. Burke turned, confusion knitting his eyebrows, and forced out an incredulous laugh. "Chief, She's a dependent, Collins. Some entitled spouse who can't follow basic perimeter lines. Ava said nothing. She didn't have to. Because Collins's expression, sharp enough to cut steel, told everyone that the general's ignorance had just reached catastrophic levels. General, the admiral said, projecting his voice so every soldier, every family member, every staffer, every recording phone could hear him clearly. You struck a Navy SEAL. Silence. Absolute silence. Even kids stopped crying. Burke's face drained of color. A what? Collins stepped beside Ava, positioning himself with unmistakable respect. This woman, he said, and his tone held a kind of weight that silenced even the murmurs in the back, is Chief Petty Officer Ava Reyes, decorated operator of a classified integration program, Silver Star recipient, Purple Heart recipient, Joint Valor Award recipient. And you, he shifted his gaze to Burke, every syllable pronounced like a sentencing, hit her in front of her children. If the ground had cracked open beneath Burke, he could not have looked more undone. His mouth hung open, then snapped shut with a dry click. His throat bobbed. He stammered. She had no insignia. She had no identification. She shouldn't have. She was holding her child. Collins cut in. And you assaulted her. The admiral turned to the sergeant. Sergeant, please escort Chief Reyes and her children to the medical tent. They are to be treated as VIPs and placed under protective supervision. The sergeant saluted so fast his hand nearly shook, bending toward Ava with reverence, not protocol. Yes, sir. Ma'am, this way. But before she followed him, Ava spoke for the first time since the slap, her voice calm, steady, and devastating. General Burke, she said, turning her head just enough for her eyes to meet his. I told you were frightening my children. You responded by escalating force. That is conduct unbecoming, abuse of authority, and a threat to minors on federal property. There was no anger in her tone, no venom, no threat, just truth. And for a man like Burke, truth was more lethal than any strike she could have delivered. Collins nodded once, grim approval in his eyes. A full inquiry will begin immediately, he announced to the crowd, making sure every phone caught the words. General Burke is hereby relieved of command pending investigation. Gasps rippled through the families. Burke staggered forward, grabbing onto the remnants of his authority like they were fraying ropes. This is insane. She can't be a SEAL. She's barely old enough. She was 25 when she completed her pipeline. Collins said sharply. You would know that if you paid attention to the personnel you outranked. Ava's children clung to her legs. She gently lifted one into her arms, then the other, standing tall, steady, unfazed, a quiet storm contained within a woman who could have destroyed Burke physically, but chose instead to let justice do what justice rarely gets the chance to do. Act in plain sight. As she followed the sergeant toward the medical tent, the crowd parted for her, not because of fear, but because of something closer to reverence. Even the Marines who had been at ease only minutes ago now stood at attention as she passed. She didn't acknowledge it, didn't bask in it, didn't seem to even notice. But I did. We all did. Because when the truth finally surfaced, when the world learned that a general with a history of unchecked temper had struck a decorated Navy SEAL mother in broad daylight, it wasn't just a scandal. It was the beginning of the end. And General Burke didn't yet realize how completely, utterly, and publicly his downfall had just begun. You would think that once the truth came out, once every witness, every camera angle, every trembling voice confirmed exactly what had happened, that the fallout would unfold with the fiery speed of an explosion, a rapid chain reaction that instantly consumed General Burke's career. But it was slower than that, more methodical, more precise, like watching a fortress collapse not because it was struck, but because someone finally shined a light on the rot in its foundation. The inquiry began within the hour, a task force assembled so quickly it felt pre-scripted, as though everyone had been waiting for the moment Burke's temper finally crossed a line even he couldn't outrun. Statements were collected, videos uploaded, timestamps confirmed, and through it all Ava Reyes remained astonishingly composed. Not silent, just steady. She answered questions with the clarity of someone who'd been trained to recall events under chaos. She held her children on her lap, while investigators apologized to her more times than they asked her anything. She never asked for special treatment. though everyone in the room knew she had earned more recognition than most people in uniform ever would. What fascinated me wasn't her calm, but the way her calm affected everyone else. Officers who had once hesitated around authority now stood straighter. Enlisted personnel seemed to carry a new sense of purpose. Even the civilians sensed it. The feeling that something overdue was finally happening, that accountability, real accountability, was about to strike where it had been needed for far too long. Burke, meanwhile, fought the process like a drowning man clawing at water. He argued. He threatened lawsuits. He shouted about fairness, about misinterpretation, about optics, and misplaced sympathy. He even attempted to twist the narrative into one where he was the real victim, where an unmarked SEAL who dared show up in civilian clothing had intentionally set him up. But every excuse fell apart under the weight of evidence. Every attempt to salvage his reputation cracked like thin ice beneath his own footsteps. And eventually, after 48 hours of chest-thumping and denial, Burke sat in a cramped conference room facing the review board, pale and quivering, with nothing left to swing but his pride. Ava entered the room not as a warrior seeking revenge, but as a mother who had endured enough. She wore simple jeans and a navy blue t-shirt, nothing like the immaculate uniforms of the officers seated around her. Her children waited in the hallway with the child care officer, blissfully unaware of the storm their mother was walking into. And when she sat down across from Burke, who could no longer meet her eyes, you could feel the air shift again. Not with tension, not with anger, but with truth. She spoke for less than 10 minutes. No dramatics, no grandstanding. She described the slap, the fear on her children's faces, the lack of any warning or provocation, the misuse of authority. And then she concluded with a single line that I know will haunt Burke for the rest of his life. I spent years fighting to keep this country safe. The last thing I expected was to protect my children from one of our own. Burke flinched like she had physically struck him. But she didn't look triumphant. She looked tired. Deeply, painfully tired. The board deliberated for only 20 minutes, but honestly, they could have decided in 2. Burke was stripped of his command, placed on immediate suspension, and referred for formal misconduct charges. Within a week, he was forced into retirement. Within a month, he lost every chance at any advisory role, speaking engagement, or defense contract consulting job he'd lined up. His name was quietly removed from committees, projects, and honors he once expected to define his legacy. His downfall wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, clinical, irreversible. But the real moment, the one that stuck with everyone who witnessed it, came the morning the verdict was delivered. Burke stormed out the side exit of the building, face red, suit wrinkled, grumbling about betrayal and politics, only to find Ava standing nearby, waiting for her kids to finish a snack someone had handed them. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him, didn't grant him the satisfaction of even a flicker of attention. Not because she didn't care, but because he simply no longer mattered. That was the exact second Burke finally understood the truth. She had destroyed him without ever lifting a hand, without shouting, without threatening, without leaning on her rank. She ruined him simply by being who she was, and by refusing to bend. He left in silence, swallowed by the crowd, while Ava crouched down to wipe her daughter's face, smiling softly when the child giggled at something insignificant and innocent, something untouched by all the ugliness swirling around them. In the weeks that followed, Ava became something of a quiet symbol, though she never asked for it and never embraced the attention. She was invited to speak at leadership programs, asked to provide insight at ethics briefings, and requested by name to instruct new officers about accountability and composure under pressure. Not because she was a SEAL, plenty of operators had stories worth telling, but because she had endured something deeply unfair and somehow emerged stronger without letting bitterness consume her. She didn't brag about bringing down a general. She didn't boast about her career or her medals or her strength. She just kept going, raising her children with the same unwavering steadiness she had shown in the moment Burke struck her. And the base slowly shifted too. Policies revised, training strengthened, culture recalibrated. People whispered her name with respect, not intrigue. Recruits stood straighter when she passed. Officers lowered their voices when discussing her. And for the first time in a long time, leadership seemed to recognize the importance of humility. As for Ava, the last time I saw her, She was on the playground behind the chapel, pushing her kids on the swings while the sun dipped low behind the trees. She looked peaceful, not triumphant, not vengeful, just whole. A young mother who had survived battlefields most people would never know existed, and who had faced an entirely different kind of war at home, one she never asked for, but still won. When another parent approached her, thanking her quietly for standing up for all of us, Ava simply smiled and said, "Strength isn't about fighting. It's about knowing when not to." And that was it. That was her victory speech, if you could even call it that. Gentle, honest, human. General Burke's career ended in disgrace. Ava's life moved forward with dignity, and the rest of us learned something we should have already known. Power means nothing without integrity, and sometimes the quietest person in the crowd is the one holding the weight of entire worlds on her shoulders.